Hey guys, we talk from time to time about French boats, and so far that's always meant Beneteau or Jeanneau, or even Amel, the one we all know and love. And they're all being made in a place called France. And the French do seem to turn out a lot of really capable, usually pretty fancy boats, don't they? But what about a different French boat? A boat not made in France, not even made in Europe, a boat made in Quebec, which if you check, I think you'll find that that's in a place called Canada. Now, Canada has made a lot of news lately because of a certain, shall we say, group of transport trucks. But back in the 1970s, Canada was making news for something else entirely: racing sailboats. This week on Everything You Need to Know, the name Robert Perry is going to come up again. And we're talking about Mirage yachts. Canada may just be the Great White North to many people, and to be honest, most of it is. With a population of usually a little over 10% of the US, and a climate that's usually mostly frozen, you might wonder what business Canadians have even building sailboats. It'd be like Hawaiians trying to build igloos. But when you look more closely, it starts to make a lot of sense. Most of us Canucks don't actually live up in the snowy part that never de-thaws. I mean, who would want to? Actually, and this is a cool fact, 50% of Canadians live below this red line. And for my American friends, you may notice that that is more southern than many Americans actually live. Most of us live more southern than many people in Washington, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even some parts of Michigan. Some Canadians actually live directly in parallel with some Americans that live in Northern California. It's always interesting on my travels through the US. I've spent a lot of time, and I still spend a lot of time traveling through the US, and explaining to my American sailor friends that where I grew up is just south of Detroit. So if you look at a map of Michigan and you see Detroit, I grew up south of it, under it. And I always get asked, I thought you were Canadian. I am. I was raised in Windsor, Ontario, where if you drive from the middle of Windsor due north, up on the map, you land in Michigan. The climate we enjoy is all around the Great Lakes. It's actually fairly warm, with summers of around 85 to 90 degrees, and we get about 7 months of sailing each year. Canada also has the longest coastline in the world, with many people living on the Atlantic and the Pacific side. We also have a waterway to go from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, so you could sail from, say, Lake Erie up through Quebec and access the Atlantic Ocean without ever touching the Mississippi, the Great Loop, or the Erie Canal. All this brings me back to French sailboats. Back in the early 70s, there was a French-Canadian couple named Dick and Irene Steffen living just outside Montreal, and they owned a boat dealership selling the legendary brand C&C Yachts. Now, their business selling C&C Yachts was located about halfway between the top of the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean, and it was going really, really well. They made a lot of really good money with that dealership. But Dick Steffen was a competitive sailboat racer, and he was always frustrated at the time that C&C didn't make anything smaller than the C&C 27. Dick wanted to race in a different class and thought that there must be a really good market to sell a competitive 24-footer through North America. He did have a great relationship with C&C because he was selling so many of their boats for them, so he went to them and asked, "Hey C&C, can you design a 24-footer? I think it'll sell really well." Now, can you imagine that today? It's like a Ford dealership owner going to Ford directly and asking them to build a totally new model because he thinks it'll sell really well. He'd be laughed at. The corporate world was a different place back in the 70s, apparently. C&C actually obliged the request, and they got to work designing a 24-footer. When the design was done, C&C sort of stepped back and examined the business model around this new boat, and they decided they didn't want to actually produce it. Not cool, C&C, but they would learn their lesson later. So Dick, frustrated that the 24-footer he wanted C&C to make was put on a shelf somewhere in mothballs, he made a deal to buy the design from C&C, and they actually sold it to him. Shortly after, Dick founded Mirage Yachts. I don't know where he got the name from. And he set out to produce the boat that would actually end up competing with the C&C line. I guess a note to corporate America: listen to your employees. They have some good ideas. So Mirage Yachts started out on the second floor of some rental building out in Pointe Claire, Quebec, which is a sailing mecca in Canada, and they started to sell their boats. Lots and lots of boats. The Little 24 found its foot in racing almost immediately in something called the MORC, which is the Midget Ocean Racing Club. Even 15 years after launch, a Mirage 24 would go on to win the production boat division in the MORC at 15 years old. Now, CNC was paying attention and they took note, and not to be outdone by some lowly dealership owner, they got to work designing a competitor. And that's how we ended up with the beloved CNC 25. I think we've all known somebody who's had one of these. They're wonderful. I've had one. This is a lot like the Mirage 24 that Dick was selling, but in many cases, the Mirage actually beat the CNC on race day. Talk about a kick in the keel. This reminds me of Ferruccio Lamborghini when he tried to tell Ferrari that there were a few improvements that Ferrari could make to their car, and Ferrari laughed at him. So Ferruccio stopped making tractors and created the first supercar as we know it, laughing all the way to the bank. With the 24 being so successful, Dick was ambitious and he wanted to get started on some more designs. Still a friend to CNC, for whatever reason, he approached them and again asked them to design another boat. This one just a bit bigger than the 24, but CNC said no, of course, because they thought it would hurt the sales of their other boats. Yet another mistake made by CNC. So what's a newly successful boat builder to do when CNC won't hook him up with another design? Easy. Get a hold of two of the world's world-class, top-of-the-charts sailboat designers to help him out. He got Peter Schmidt to design a Mirage 27, and the following year, the one and only Robert Perry to pen up a Mirage 26. Now I know we talk a lot about Robert Perry around here. In fact, we just talked about him last week. You'll find his mark on probably 3 of the top 10 sailboat designs anywhere in the world at any sort of year throughout the 70s and 80s. He really is world class, and there wasn't another designer around at the time with the same success on his resume. The business, of course, took off again with the new designs, and needing more space, they moved to Vaudreuil, Quebec. Now, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I am Canadian, but I don't speak French. The new facility was some 12,000 square feet, and they quickly found that to be too small. So they moved again, this time to 30,000 square feet. And again, it was too small, so they expanded that to 35,000 square feet. They even made their own spars in a 5,000 square foot facility in Dorian, Quebec. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make this whole channel really possible. A big shout out to this week's newest patrons, Danny, Adam, and Scott. Thank you guys so very much. I really couldn't do it without you. Now, legendary designer Robert Perry stuck around and he designed some more boats, not just the 26. He designed the 30 and the 33. He had a knack for designing these sort of extremely comfortable, livable family cruisers that would also double as extremely competitive race boats on the weekend or in the club races during the week. It really was a boat for all people. A new breed of boat had entered the racing scene, and what was once a race-winning design like the Mirage 26 just wasn't good enough anymore. We have the introduction of the J-boat to thank for that. Innovation waits for no one. So the J24 hits the scene and immediately starts dominating. And of course, Dick wanted a piece of it. He wanted to start building the J24 in Canada in his facilities. And he tried, but he just couldn't make a deal that would actually work for everybody. But Dick being Dick, he was not going to be left out in the cold. That was not going to stop him. So he took a page from his old playbook. He sought out the best race boat designer he could afford at the time. And instead of building the J24, he would make something that would beat the J24. And he found that designer in Bruce Kirby. You may remember Bruce Kirby from a little design that he made called the Laser, like one of the most successful race designs ever made. So Kirby comes on board and they drew up a design specifically targeted at beating the J24, which is not easy. And that's how we ended up with the legendary Kirby 25. The 25 quickly started kicking that J-boat's butt. With its 3,100 pounds of glass, it had a fractional sloop rig, a 4-foot fixed keel, and a spade rudder. The 25 was more race than anything else. There was no silly things like tankage or a galley or, you know, that thing called a head, which is sort of extreme for a 25-footer because you could have easily fit a head in it, at minimum. The name of the game, however, wasn't comfort, it was winning. And win it did, in spades. And just when you thought it was over, J-Boats releases the J30. So now we've gotten 5 feet bigger into a different class. So Dick, along with Bruce Kirby, were back at the drawing board. And that got us the Kirby 30, which later would result in a Mirage model as well. And again, the race was on to become the dominant force in sailboat racing in all these respective classes. There was a lot of success through the 80s, both in family cruisers and race boats, but ultimately what led to the slowdown of Mirage and Kirby and Perry selling these boats were other French-made boats, but this time they were French-made boats from the other side of the pond. At the time, there was a really favorable exchange rate between Europe and North America, and that gave way to European boat manufacturers being able to market, import, and sell their boats in North America, so Dick had to do something to stay competitive. A few new designs came out, he hired some more designers and kept the ball rolling as he had been, and he was doing really well, but toward the late 80s he was starting to look at retiring. So Dick put his successful sailboat company up for sale in 1989, and in hindsight it was just in the nick of time. Family sailboats would soon take a huge dive in sales throughout the early 90s, and while we had no way to know this, most smaller companies, like Mirage, would actually end up going out of business entirely. Dick found a local Montreal-based investor to buy Mirage yachts, and Dick just cashed out. Just in time, the investor actually went out of business shortly after, and unfortunately he took the Mirage nameplate with him. The final boat produced was in 1989, and it was an H. Morton design. It was the Mirage 39, the last in the lineage. The Mirage line of boats comes with some really great stories. I've been on them. I have some stories of my own on Mirage boats, but one such story hits really close to home for me, and it's a shining example of not just Mirage and small entrepreneurial business sort of thing. It's also a really shining example of women in sailing and women racing sailboats more and more as the years go on. In an article in Canadian Yachting by Paul Howard, a woman sailor named Diane Waite is highlighted. Diane had been out on Lake Ontario, outside of Toronto, a few times in a sailboat with some friends, and you know the age-old story. Some people just get hooked. You can take them out once or twice and they are hooked. And Diane fell into that category. She got the sailing bug. So she set out to find herself a brand new sailboat with some fairly strict specifications. She needed to be able to handle it by herself, so it had to be a little bit smaller or easier to single hand. It also had to be comfortable enough that she wouldn't want to upgrade in the next couple of years or sort of trade up. Avoid that 2-foot-itis, which we unfortunately all have, you have to admit. So good luck avoiding that. Diane went to the Toronto Boat Show several times. It's a yearly show of all the new sailboats. Think Annapolis, but smaller. And she went looking for the perfect match boat for her. This is early 80s. And she ended up in 1982 putting her hard-earned dollars down as a deposit on a Mirage 26, the Robert Perry one. She found her first racing experience on her new boat in the Harbor City Yacht Club's Women's Series in Toronto. There was a women's series of racing sailboats in 1982. Think about how progressive that must have been back then. Diane sails with a crew of 5 or 6 other women, and usually places well above average, touting numerous first-place finishes. When asked about the Mirage 26, Diane said she made some minor changes. One of them was upgrading winches. She took the Lumar 10s that it came with as sheet winches and went to Lumar 16s. You get more bite and less work. She replaced cabin top winches, relocated a couple of spinnaker winches, but all in all, she said the design of the 26 was almost absolutely perfect, and very minimal modifications needed to be made to make it a successful race boat. That's it for this week, guys. I hope you liked the episode. If you want to see your boat or a boat that you like featured, please let me know in the comments. If you like this video, don't hesitate to give it a thumbs up. It helps with the YouTube algorithm witchcraft. And don't forget to subscribe. I will see you guys next week.